This video analyzes the game played between Marshall, who played with the white pieces, and Tarash, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was D51. This opening is called the Queen's Gambit declined, 4.bg5 and bd7 sidelines. Result, black won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4. Although queen's pawn openings are played with the idea of obtaining an early positional advantage, Marshall considered the best way to start an attack was to begin the game with 1.d4. One reason for his view might have been that the e-pawn openings no longer could be depended on to lead to wide-open games with opportunities for combinative play. In the old days when white began with 1.e4, the reply almost automatically was 1 black e5. White could then offer a pawn by 2.f4, rely on its being accepted, and joyfully swing into the excitement of a king's gambit. In taking the pawn and grimly holding onto it, black gained material, but the loss of time involved threw him on the defensive gradually. After sustaining many defeats, the players of black tired of being the victims of brilliancies. They took a more rational attitude and grew cautious. They resorted to 1 black e6, 1 black c5 or 1 black c6, steering the game into channels of their own choosing. The result was that an aggressive player, starting the game with 1.e4, found himself facing irregular defenses, which forced the game into unfamiliar channels. He found himself involved in tightly knit positions requiring systematic planning, when he was itching to get an attack rolling. He was supposed to have the initiative, but here it was wrested away from him. How could he play a gambit, even at best a risky matter, if his opponent did not oblige him with a forthright 1 black e5 in answer to his own enterprising 1.e4? In beginning the game with 1.d4, white gels an advantage, slight though it may be, against any system of defense, and with it he retains excellent attacking chances as well. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d5, undoubtedly one of the strongest replies. Black stabilizes the pressure in the center, prevents white from strengthening his hold there by 2.e4, and himself opens lines for 2 of his pieces to get into the game. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c4, an offer of a pawn, with strings attached, to induce black to surrender the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e6. Taking the pawn is perfectly sound, but why give up the center to win a pawn which it turns out you cannot keep? Playing 2 black pawn from file d takes at c4 is equivalent to exchanging a center pawn for a side pawn, in itself an unprofitable transaction. However, many leading players are happy to play this opening, so there must be some counterbalancing plus points. The main advantage is that black no longer has the responsibility of supporting the d5 pawn, and this makes it easier for him to organize the crucial thrust black c5, exchanging his own c-pawn for white's d-pawn. Thus, although white has a temporary superiority in the center, it is often not long before black can restore a symmetrical central situation. After black's actual move, his d-pawn is firmly supported. If now 3 pawn from file c takes at d5, black recaptures with a pawn, maintaining a pawn in the center. It is true that black's c8 bishop is shut in by the c-pawn, making its development difficult, and this is a drawback to the defense. But if black's first two moves are good, and they probably form the best reply to the queen's gambit, then one can appreciate the terrific strength of this opening, and why so many players adopt 1.d4 unhesitatingly whenever they have white. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c3. This is somewhat sharper than developing the other knight first, as additional pressure is immediately put on the central point d5. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. Tarrasch did not approve of this knight move, which most of us would make instinctively. It is true that f6 is the most useful square for the king's knight 99.44% of the time, since from there it influences affairs in the center strongly, enjoys great freedom of movement, and is magnificently placed for attack and defense. However, Tarrasch feared the strength of the pin that white can clamp on the knight next move. Instead of 3 black knight moves to f6, he therefore recommended that black challenge white's center at once by 3 black c5. The advance black c5 is almost a must at some stage in queen's pawn games, meanwhile opening up the c-file for the use of his own heavy pieces. Why then, you may ask, did Tarrasch play a move that he himself disparaged? His explanation is that this was the first game of a match against one of the world's leading masters. Marshall had recently won the Cambridge Springs tournament without losing a game, ahead of Lasker, Schlechter, Pillsbury and Janowski, and he did not wish to stray so soon from orthodox paths. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to g5 naturally. Not only because the bishop exerts uncomfortable pressure on the knight, but also because it is good policy to play moves that the opponent finds disturbing. Tarrasch thinks that pinning the knight is troublesome. Pin the knight and make him uneasy. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight from file b moves to d7. This looks clumsy, with the knight blocking what little view the c8 bishop had, but pieces can easily step out of each other's way. The knight belongs on d7 and not on c6, where it obstructs the c-pawn. This pawn must not be hindered from advancing sooner or later to c5. Little as the pawn is, it represents a major force in disputing possession of the center. With 4 black and bd7, black sets a little trap for the unwary, invented by Tarrasch. If white, relying on the impotent state of black's pinned knight, tries to pick up a pawn by 5. Pawn from file c takes at d5. Pawn from file e takes at d5 6. Knight takes at d5. Black gives up his queen with 6. Black knight takes at d5, breaking the pin by force, 7. Bishop takes at d8, only to regain it with another piece thrown in by 7. Black bishop moves to b4, check. 8 queen moves to d2. Bishop takes at d2, check. 9 king takes at d2. King takes at d8. The moral is, don't go pawn hunting in the opening. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e3. This sort of pawn move is not a waste of time. Without a liberating pawn move the bishops can never get off the ground, so this is part of the process of bringing the pieces into play. With the text move, White opens two diagonals at once, one for his f1 bishop and another one for the queen. The e-pawn contributes an additional service in bracing up the pawn center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c6. Black 2 reinforces his pawn center and gives his queen an outlet on the queen side. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c2. It is customary to develop the minor pieces first, roughly in this order: first the knights, generally to c3 and f3, but toward the center in any event, then the bishops, after the necessary pawn moves, either to control vital diagonals or to pin enemy knights. Following this, it is time for the queen to make her entrance. If the queen comes into the game too early, she incurs the danger of being harassed, perhaps even surrounded and captured by enemy minor pieces. Last come the rooks, which after castling are brought to c1, d1, or c1, to head tiles in the center which are partly open. These files are likely to become completely open after pawn exchanges in the center. This method of development is not by any means to be considered a fixed course to pursue. Nothing in chess, no convention, principle, or recommended procedure is to be practiced rigidly. The value of any single move or combination of moves can only be measured with respect to the particular position on the board. It must fit in with the scheme of the game you are playing and be tempered by the demands of the opponent. A great deal depends on what he does, or lets you do. This is why you may find it expedient to develop the queen at the 6th move or to castle at the 60th move. In this position black has indicated that he might counter-attack by 6 black queen moves to a5 and 7 black bishop moves to b4, pinning the c3 knight and then increasing the pressure on it. It might have been more to the point for white instead to mobilize another minor piece by 6. Knight moves to f3, like putting money in the bank, with an eye to speedy castling or perhaps to neutralizing the anticipated pressure on the c3 knight by swinging the f3 knight over to d2. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h6, a many-sided move. The queen not only unpins the f6 knight but starts a counteraction by pinning the white knight. Black threatens to intensify the pressure by bringing the f8 bishop to b4. As an extra, added attraction, black sets a little trap to catch the careless, and this might even include expert players who at times treat the opening in a perfunctory way. The trap might snap shut on a player who innocently develops his bishop at d3 only to find that 7 black pawn from file d takes at c4 threatens both his bishops at one blow. White cannot escape from the trap by 8. Bishop takes at f6 as 8 black pawn from file c takes at d3 attacks his queen and wins a bishop. It might be as well to state at this point that Tarrasch did not expect to catch Marshall with such a primitive trap. Master players do not set traps if it involves injuring their own position. A trap which arises in the natural course of development is one thing, but to play for them deliberately at the risk of wasting valuable time is unforgivable. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file c takes at d5. White neutralizes the queen's indirect attack on his bishop and clears away the c-file for the benefit of his major pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at d5. Tarrasch had planned to recapture by 7. Black pawn from file c takes at d5 in order to maintain a pawn in the center. Now he realizes that danger may be involved in delaying the development of the queenside pieces any longer. His c8 bishop is locked in on one side by the d7 knight, and this knight must slay where it is, as it supports the other knight on f6. If he tries to develop the bishop on the queen side, then after black b6 he cuts off the queen's retreat. But the strategy of a master player must be flexible, it must be consistent with the requirements of the particular position at hand. Tarrasch would very much like to have a strong pawn center but dares not neglect the exigencies of development. So he heeds Nimzowitsk, who once said, "Giving up the center must not here be regarded as illogical. Was happiness no happiness because it endured for but a short time? One cannot always be happy." Meanwhile the knight does add to the pressure on White's pinned knight and renews the threat of winning the exposed bishop by 8. Black knight takes at c3. 9. Pawn from file b takes at c3. Queen takes at g5. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f3, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to e4, in his anxiety, says Tarrasch, to guard the threatened bishop. White makes a decisive mistake. This is an interesting example of the value of accurate liming in chess. The fact that a normal developing move has intrinsic strength is secondary to the question of its usefulness in the one position in front of you, not in vaguely similar positions. Despite the fact that the knight occupies a most useful post at f3, and at the same time protects the bishop, its development is either too soon or too late. White is doing nothing about the problem of his pinned knight. This is where pressure is exerted, this is where danger is threatened. More to the point is 8.e4 instead, evicting Black's knight and forcing it to declare its intentions. If then 8. Black knight takes at c3. 9. Bishop moves to d2. Queen moves to a4. 10. Queen takes at c3, White has resolved an uncomfortable situation. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b4, tripling the attack on the knight. Black threatens to win at once by 9. Black knight takes at c3. 10. Pawn from file b takes at c3. Bishop takes at c3, check. Followed by 11. Black bishop takes at a1. How shall White meet the threat? If he plays the natural 9. Rook moves to c1, the knight is adequately guarded since it is attacked 3 times and defended 3 times. However, Black then capitalizes on a curious fact about the power of a pinned piece. Not only is it helpless to make a move, but it has also lost its ability to defend. Translated into chess language, this means that 9. Rook moves to c1 can be met by 9. Black queen takes at a2, a capture startling at first glance but an obvious one if we realize that the knight's defensive power is illusory. I stress this circumstance because it is important. Knowing it, recognizing it, and applying it has caused chess kingdoms to topple. All this fuss about winning a miserable a-pawn? Let's see what would happen thereafter, after 9. Rook moves to c1, queen takes at a2. Black's method is classical in its simplicity. He follows up by black bishop takes at c3, check. And after the recapture by the pawn exchanges queens. He has an extra pawn, but this is not enough advantage to bring about checkmate. He must increase his material superiority sufficiently to justify him in going after the king, and this can only be done by turning one of his pawns into a queen. So he selects the most likely candidate, in this case the passed a pawn, and pushes it step by step up the board. The pawn's advance faces the opponent with a problem that becomes more acute with every step taken by the pawn. He must head off the pawn or blockade it completely, in either case tying up one or more of his pieces to do so. The defense is under the strain of keeping the pawn under constant surveillance, while at the same time having to guard against a sudden switching of the attack toward his king. What often happens is that he either has to give up a piece for the pawn or allow further exchanges of pieces, a procedure which leads to inevitable loss. Such long-range plans are not based on exact calculation, they represent a general idea of the method for winning in positions of this nature. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, king moves to d2, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to c1, not an appetizing move, as the king loses the privilege of castling, but it's the only way to guard against losing some material. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c5 hits the nail on the head, says Tarash. With the subsequent exchange of pawns, the c-file will be prized open, further endangering the unfortunate knight. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a3. White is anxious to bring matters to a head. The alternative 10.e4 yields to 10. Black pawn from file c takes at d4 11. Pawn from file e takes at d5, or 11. Knight takes at d4. Knight takes at c3 12. Pawn from file b takes at c3. Queen takes at g5, check. And black wins a piece, the exposed bishop that seemed doomed from the start. 11. Black pawn from file d takes at c3, check. 12. Pawn from file b takes at c3. Queen takes at d5, check. And black is a pawn up with a winning position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at c3 check. Tarash simplifies and avoids the difficulties attendant on winning the exchange, such as 10. Black pawn from file c takes at d4 11. Pawn from file a takes at b4. Pawn from file d takes at c3, check. 12. Queen takes at c3. Queen takes at a1 13. Queen takes at g7. Rook moves to f8 14. E4. Knight takes at b4 15. Bishop moves to b5. Queen takes at h1 16. Queen moves to f6 and white forces mate. It is true that black could win the game at his 15th move by playing 15. Black queen moves to a5, but why risk all these complications when the advantage can be maintained by less hazardous means? What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, Pawn from file b takes at c3, the only way white may recapture. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file c takes at d4, continuing the good work of opening up the c file. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file e takes at d4 again. White has no choice of capture, the c-pawn is pinned, and 12. Knight takes at d4 is refuted by 12. Black knight takes at c3, 13. Queen takes at c3, queen takes at g5, when black has won a pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight from rank 7 moves to b6. White's pinned knight is gone, but it has been replaced by a pawn, and this pawn is also pinned. It makes a fine target, so black directs his fire on it. He threatens to strike at it again by 13. Black knight moves to a4, or by 13 black bishop moves to d7, followed by 14 black rook moves to c8. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d3. Finally, another kingside piece sees daylight. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to d7. Black can pounce on the pawn with 13. Black knight moves to a4, but he prefers to complete his development first and then bring all his pieces to bear on it. Besides, as he says, anticipating Nemzowitsk, the pawn does not run away. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file h moves to c1. White must develop and defend at the same time. If he gets a moment's respite, he will free the pinned pawn by 15. King moves to e2, 16. Bishop moves to d2 and 17. c4. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to c8. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to f6, but black doesn't let up even for a moment. The rook seizes control of the beautiful open file and immediately adds its weight to the pressure on the immobilized c-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to b3. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been king moves to e1, trying to lure black into 15. Black knight moves to a4 16. Queen takes at b7. Rook takes at c3 17. Rook takes at c3. Queen takes at c3, check. 18. King moves to e2, when he has counterplay. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king's side. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to f6. First, thinks Tarrasch, let's get the king away from the fighting and bring the other rook closer. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, king moves to e2. Clearly the c-pawn must be lost, as black can attack it with more pieces than white can summon up for defense, so white saves time by abandoning the pawn and fleeing with his king. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook takes at c3. The first material gain, and with it, entry to the enemy position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook takes at c3, avoiding the exchange of rooks by 17. Queen moves to b2, lets black retain his grip on the open file. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen takes at c3, much better than taking with the knight. Black's idea is to occupy a strategically strong outpost on the only open file or force an exchange of queens. The removal of the queens would simplify matters to his advantage, as he is a pawn ahead. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to b1, forced into retreat. White manages to incorporate the threat of 19. Bishop takes at h7, check. Regaining his pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to h6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been knight moves to c4, the simplest way of saving the pawn. This also provides the king with a useful escape square against a surprise check on the last rank. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d2, driven back, this piece too retires with the threat. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c7. The queen reluctantly leaves the beautiful outpost at c3 but stays on the all-important c file. Note the reason the queen selects the c7 square. At c6 the action of the bishop is interfered with, at c8 that of the rook. Black threatens 20. Black knight moves to f4, check. Forcing an exchange of the knight for one of white's bishops. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, king moves to f1. Everybody going home. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c4. Begins a new phase in which black drives pieces into the enemy's territory. These will control key squares and cramp white's move menu by limiting the mobility of his pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to c1. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been bishop moves to e1, just about the only place left. White wants to keep both his bishops. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to a4, and this cuts down the activities of white's queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to a2. Double attack on the knight. This is less a threat than a convenient means of gaining time to switch the queen over to the king's side. White's only chance, of course, is to dream up some sort of counterattack. Passive play will only lead to his being gradually crushed to death. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to c8. Black protects the knight and simultaneously takes undisputed possession of the c-file. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e2. This was a mistake. A better move would have been queen takes at c4. White intends to stir up trouble by playing 24. Queen moves to e4, threatening 25. Queen moves to h7, check. King moves to f8. 26. Queen moves to h8, check. King moves to e7. 27. Queen takes at g7. Then if 24. Black knight moves to f6, the reply 25. Queen moves to h4, threatening 26. Bishop takes at h6, might whip up some sort of attack on the king's side. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c3. Not only does this move put a stop to any notions white might have had of starting a counter-offensive, but it also restricts his queen, which is attacked, to one solitary move. Such is the extent of black's domination of the board. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e1, the only refuge left from the terrible knights who cover 7 of the queen's flight squares. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to a5 with the obvious plan of penetrating deeper into white's position by 25. Black knight moves to b3. This would result, as a start, in winning the exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at h6, lashing out with the wildness born of despair. The game could not have been saved by 25. Bishop moves to d2. It's after 25. Black knight moves to b3, the knights now circumscribe the rook's activities as they did the queen's, 26. Bishop takes at c3, queen takes at c3, 27. Rook moves to d1, or 27. Queen takes at c3, rook takes at c3, 28. Rook moves to d1, knight moves to c1, when black wins the exchange or a piece, 27. Black knight moves to c1, when the attack on white's rook and bishop will win some material. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to b3, taking the bishop might lead to a win, but why expose the king needlessly? Black's actual move is simpler and more in keeping with his queenside maneuvers up to this point. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d2. White could not rescue the helpless rook, so must content himself with the fact that he has regained the pawn he lost. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at a1, winning the exchange is the culmination of some clever horseplay by the knights. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen takes at a1, white must capture this way, and not 27. Bishop takes at c3, which loses a whole rook after 27. Black queen takes at c3. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been bishop moves to c2, the fine art of simplification. Black exchanges pieces to cut down resistance. With fewer pieces on the board, fewer complications can be introduced by white, while black's material advantage becomes proportionally greater. Notice how black engineers these exchanges without weakening his grip on the position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at b5, as good as there is, after 28. Bishop takes at c3, bishop takes at d3, check. Followed by 29. Black queen takes at c3, black wins a piece, while 28. Queen takes at c3, queen takes at c3, 29. Bishop takes at c3, bishop takes at d3, check. And 30. Black rook takes at c3 does likewise. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at b5. Now black threatens 29. Black queen moves to c4, check. 30. King moves to e1, knight moves to c3, and the threat of mate at e2 forces 31. Bishop takes at c3, whereupon 31. Black queen takes at c3, check. 32. Queen takes at c3, rook takes at c3 leaves an elementary winning position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to g3. White hopes to find shelter for the king at g2, where it is less exposed, and also sets up a pawn support for the bishop, which might get a new start at f4. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c6. The queen pounces on the light squares that have been weakened by white's last move. The attack on the knight gains a tempo for the queen's further penetration into white's territory. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, king moves to g2 and advance by the knight, e.g. 30. Knight moves to e5, loses the queen after 30. Black queen moves to h1, check. While protecting the knight with 30. King moves to e2, runs into 30. Black queen moves to e4, check. 31. Bishop moves to e3, rook moves to c2, check. 32. Knight moves to d2, or 32. King moves to d1, knight moves to c3, check. Winning, 32. Black rook moves to a2. When 33. Queen takes at a2, knight moves to c3, check. Costs white his queen, while otherwise the d4 pawn falls with check. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to d8, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to d5, now onto this file, where the isolated pawn makes a line target. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e3 guarding the d-pawn, since the pinned knight is no protection. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to e4. The queen works her way deeper into the heart of the position. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to b2. White tries to get some play for his queen, while the other pieces huddle around each other for mutual protection. The queen does not rush to seize the open file, as after 32. Queen moves to c1. Knight takes at d4. 33. Bishop takes at d4. Rook takes at d4. The threat of 34. Black rook moves to d3 is more than white can stand. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to d5. A diabolical move. Not only does black guard his own knight, but he also threatens to win white's by 33. Black rook moves to f5. 34. Queen moves to c2. Knight takes at d4, an attack on the queen and a triple attack on the knight. There is no answer to this as white is pinned all over the place. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a4 driving the knight off so that it no longer attacks the d-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to d6. The knight leaves, taking care to protect the b-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to f4, this was a mistake. A better move would have been queen moves to c3, otherwise. Black plays 34. Black g5, threatening 35. Black g4 or 35. Black rook moves to f5, or both. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f5, this was a mistake, a better move would have been pawn moves to g5, once more striking at the d-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e3, this was an inaccuracy. White cannot afford 35. Queen takes at b7 as after 35 black knight takes at d4 36. Queen moves to c8, check. King moves to h7 37. Queen moves to c3 g5 he loses more material. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at e3 check, simpler than combinations beginning with 35 black e5. After the text move, two more pieces come off the board, and another pawn will fall. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file f takes at e3 white must recapture. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen takes at e3 this unpins the knight, but the knight must stay where it is to protect the d-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to g4 white must not play 37. Queen takes at b7 as the reply 37 black queen moves to e2, check. Forces the king away from the knight and costs a piece. His actual move stops black from increasing the pressure by 37 black rook moves to f5. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to f5, this was a mistake, a better move would have been pawn moves to b6, black can afford this opening up of the position. His king suffers less from exposure than does white's. The threat of course is 38 black pawn from file f takes at g4, winning at once. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to g5 after 38. H3 pawn from file f takes at g4 39. Pawn from file h takes at g4 queen moves to f4 40. G5 queen moves to g4, check. 41 king moves to f2 rook moves to f5 the threats of 42 black queen takes at f3, check. And 42 black queen takes at g5 cannot both be met. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to e4 once more, clamping a pin on the knight. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c3, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to g6, carefully avoiding 39. Queen takes at b7, when 39 black f4 faces him with loss of the knight by 40, black queen moves to e2, check. Or loss of the g-pawn by 40, black rook takes at g5, check. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to f4, this was a mistake. A better move would have been king moves to h7, not at once 39 black e5 because 40.g6 leaves white threatening sudden mate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c8, check. This was a blunder. A better move would have been king moves to h3, if white had tried 40.g6 then 40 black rook moves to g5, check. Would end the g-pawn's career. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to h7 to escape any more checks by the queen. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c3, back to the defense of the knight and the d-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e5, this signals the beginning of the last phase, the breakup of white's center. This is stronger than 41 black rook takes at g5, check. 42 king moves to f2, rook moves to h5, 43.h4, when white threatens 44. Knight moves to g5, check. The idea of the text move is to continue with 42 black rook takes at d4, with which black accomplishes these things. He has demolished white's center. He threatens an immediate win by 43 black rook moves to d3. He is assured, if the foregoing is not convincing enough, of remaining with two connected passed pawns in the center. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h4, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been king moves to f2, Marshall sees that 42. Pawn from file d takes at e5 loses a piece after 42 black rook moves to d3, but he still has a few tricks up his sleeve. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook takes at d4 intending to attack queen and knight by 43. Black rook moves to d3, incidentally cutting off the queen from the knight's defense. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to g6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to e1, this is one of the traps. If black plays 43, black king takes at g6, white replies 44. Queen moves to b3, apparently trying to get a perpetual check, 44. Black rook moves to d3, and now instead of 45. Queen moves to e6, check. White plays 45. Queen takes at d3, queen takes at d3, 46. Knight takes at e5, check. Followed by 47. Knight takes at d3, regaining the queen and winning a took. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to h6, black sidesteps this one. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, king moves to h2, so white sets up another trap. If 44, black rook moves to d3, 45. Queen takes at e5, queen takes at f3, then 46. Queen moves to g5, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to e2, check, 0-1. To this there is no reply, 45. King moves to g1, rook moves to d1, check. 46. Knight moves to e1, rook takes at e1, check. Wins, or 45. King moves to h3, rook moves to d3, pinning the poor knight for the last time, puts out the last flickers of resistance.